recording. Um, I would also, yes, Drea, thank you for asking folks to introduce themselves in the chat. Um, Tonight, as I said, we are going to be asking some really important questions. We draw from this metaphor of the kaleidoscope because it really speaks to what we're trying to do tonight. As you look through a kaleidoscope, rotating the instrument causes the materials inside to swirl, resulting in an ever-changing view being presented. And so in this conversation, we're asking, how might turning away from the hegemonic norms that govern schooling across the globe allow us to see new visions of what education can and ought to be? What comes into focus as our gaze rotates in search of alternative ways forward? We've brought together a very international collection of panelists tonight. We're also trying something a little bit new and bringing in some asynchronous participants who we'll hear from through some pre-recorded videos that have been prepared for this evening. Once we get through some introductions from our panelists, we'll move into the main event, which will be a conversation that unfolds between our synchronous participants tonight. If time allows, we will invite the audience to participate in this conversation with their voices. We'll invite questions and comments at the end, but we're also going to be trying something a little bit different tonight. The educators in the room probably know Padlet very well. And so what we have done is create a Padlet as a way to expand opportunities for participation in this conversation. I'll put a link in the chat in just a moment. Just kidding, Drea is on it. Thank you so much. And so as you're listening along tonight, use this space as a spot to add your voices to the conversation. You'll see some prompts at the top, but there's also a section at the bottom where you can add anything you like, an image, a link, a Spotify song, a YouTube video. I've left some examples so that you can also see some more from our asynchronous participants, a faculty bio page for Dr. Tasneem Amatola, and we also have Anjan Prakash's description of herself on her blog, How I Wonder What You Are. So please use this space as a way to expand your participation tonight. So with that being said, we will get into introductions. I think first up, we have Shobita.
All right, thanks, Lydia. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Lydia, do you want me to share some slides in the intro or just...
It's really up to you. If you think that, you know, you can do it without, go for it, but you also have the screen share permission because I know you prepared them for us.
Okie dokie, give me one sec. Okay, I'll go into full screen. All right, I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro. I am currently in India, in Bangalore, India, starting my 4th year of doctoral research in science education. One of the titles that I'm looking at is Authoring Science and Indigenous Spirituality as an Agentic Tool for Self, Species, and Societal Development. And I'm looking at a very specific case that I'm studying and kind of involved in Bangalore called Ecogram. I'm a 30-year veteran teacher in science ed. I started in Teach for America, started in the Bronx. I've gone from like public education to private education, New York to LA, Indiana, India. And in these 30 years, I've kind of been in the same role, teaching 6 through 12 science ed in different spaces with different income levels of access for kids and for teachers. And what I wanted to talk about today is how I'm seeing science education applied in crisis spaces. Bangalore is a city about 13 million people. New York, where I work and live, also is about 16 million. And this specific case study that I'm looking at was once a landfill, currently serves 10 village panchayats or 10 bordering communities and 4,200 households that have come together. Mostly the women, the mothers and the grandmothers of these villages have turned a landfill space into a zero waste sustainable ecosystem over the course of about 7 years. And I'm interested in seeing how the community is using indigenous spirituality, indigenous science practices to kind of say, break away from current curricula to address the environmental damage that they've been facing over the years from urban waste and urban sprawl. And I'm interested also in seeing how that model can be applied in different urban spaces, especially in the Bronx, where I live in New York, that faces similar environmental challenges that then in turn pose health hazards and increasing asthma and different results of what happens in these kind of communities. So that's where I'm coming from, and I have more slides, but I won't bring them up now.
Great.
Should I
Awesome.
pass
Thank
the
you.
mic?
Yeah, you can pass it back to me. I don't know if you know the order, but Madhu
I
is
saw
going
it,
to
yes.
be up next, and Madhu will also be following up his introduction with some video commentary from Anjan Prakash.
Good evening, everyone. It is great to be here. I see some familiar names in the Zoom roster there. I see Dr. Shanley and Dr. Deckman. And it's good to be here because I've been asking a question that's kind of stuck in my head about education and the way it's structured. Quick background, I'm a graduate of the CUNY doctoral program. I forget the cohort number. I want to say 14 or 15, but it's the same one as Sean, so Sean can help me out when we get to him. And or maybe he can. But I was an educator in the Bronx. I was a teacher, assistant principal, and principal at a high school in the Bronx, and now I'm an assistant professor at Portland State University, and I teach in the educational leadership and policy program. And one of my big interests is in how educational institutions, or maybe better said, the institution of education, shapes our perceptions of the world and shapes our identities, our very conceptions of who we are. And one of the things, I went to school, I went to college, and then I worked in schools. So I spent like many of you, 30 plus years just part of this institution of education. And it does something to you to be part of these places where you show up at a certain time, you have bells telling you where to go, you have a teacher who teaches you a given subject, you're given a grade. All these things, they kind of shape how we think about ourselves, how we think about our place in the world, how we think about what's right and what's wrong. And one of the questions that has come up with that I've come across more recently is as a result of having had a chance of working with some incredible educators across the world. I'm going to play a video of a short conversation with one of them in a moment here. The question that has come up to me that I kind of come up with frequently is, why is this thing called school so similar no matter where we go? Now, you may see that question, and I like the way that Lydia and Drea phrased it in the Padlet, which is like, in your opinion, do you feel like teachers are prepared in the same way? Do you feel like there's a standardized system of education? So you might disagree with me on if you think the system of education is similar, but I'll just ask you to consider a couple things. First of all, that in most places you go in the world, when you get to 5 or 6 years old, you're expected to go to a school. That's kind of just a norm in this world that wasn't there 100 years ago. Second, when you go to school, you tend to be grouped with people who are the same age as you. You tend to be in a room with one teacher in front of you who has a chalkboard or a blackboard or a whiteboard, and while the rest of you are in desks facing the teacher. Every year you have to take some test, or there's some benchmark you have to pass to get to the next level. It's just the more I think about it, and the more I look at it, it's just a strange way for us to organize ourselves and to organize our society, and more importantly, to pass on the knowledge from one generation to the next. It actually changes, in my opinion, the type of knowledge that we pass on to one another. So that's the question that's just been bothering me, because like many of you, you're probably wondering and or troubled by how unequal our society is, how resources and status and power are all distributed very unequally in our society. And I just feel there's a connection between the way our institutions of education are structured and those realities. So those are the kind of questions that I want to probe and I want to dive into today with all of you. So with that, I'd like to share a video. I have two people. I mentioned that I had a chance to connect with many educators across the world, and I had two of them agreed to share some of their thoughts. And one of them is Dr. Tasneem Amatullah. She's a professor in ed leadership at Emirates College in Abu Dhabi. And her particular focus is on Islamic leadership or educational leadership. And, it's a field I don't know anything about, but it helped challenge me in how I thought about how school or education could be structured. So I'm going to share my screen and play a short excerpt from my conversation with her.
And your research interests are on Islamic educational leadership, and you've actually just written a book on this topic. So I wanted to start with the question, what have you learned in your studies about Islamic-based educational leadership?
Thank you so much, Madhu, for inviting me to such an interesting panel. I mean, when I read the theme of the panel itself, many ideas, many thoughts came to my mind. And in fact, my recent work on Islamic-based educational leadership, where I served as a co-editor, and we had 3 more editors on our book, which we put together. The basic argument was that we wanted to pull in, more culturally relevant leadership styles into the realm of educational leadership domain itself. And this field has been growing rapidly. We have some pioneer scholars in this field like Shah, and Brooke, Melanie Brooke. They have studied about Islamic leadership, and we are building the scholarship on that. So we know that there has been so much of immigration, people moving around the world, and the world is extremely multicultural, different religions, different backgrounds, different geographical countries. With that being said, we wanted the school leaders to really consider the diverse populations they are serving, irrespective of which part of the world they are in, and being educated about these, identities that both their students, their co-workers bring when they are in this, space of educating or, developing global citizens. People need to be aware of what their own values are and how can they actually get the best out of them. So with that agenda of, serving the population that you are working with, it could be, a Muslim serving in a non-Muslim country to a very diverse population, or it could be the other way around, a person who is not following the Muslim beliefs, but is serving a Muslim population or a diverse population in a multicultural country like say US or Canada, or even like India. You can think about different combinations, but then the world is so global. And this is why we felt like, this scholarship needs to be expanded, and the voices should be more from the people from the part of the world. And we've seen mostly, the literature has been written by, researchers coming from other parts of the world and studying in this, Middle Eastern world and having different narratives. So our intention was to actually, specifically my chapter, which focuses on female leadership narratives, because what I witnessed here in this part of the world when thinking about female leaders, they are empowered, and we have so many female leaders, no oppression, nothing. But when I was in my doctoral studies, what I read about women and leadership, and especially in this context, it was a different narrative, different stories than to what I have witnessed and experienced it. So I was like, well, this is just not saying, the true things that I have experienced, and I want to present the counter narratives. So that's when I actually started writing about Islamic educational leadership. My dissertation was also focused on the same area, where I shed light on female leadership narratives in higher education in the context of Doha, Qatar. So that's how this entire thing, began. And what we then propose, in this book is for scholars to think about, one's own beliefs, their epistemologies, what are they grounded in, and then think about it as an ecological model, and how are they understanding, this entire practices in the context of relationship with both the humans, and also think about the hereafter. So that's something that is unique about leadership. We just don't think about your connection with the humans, but we also think about the connection with the God itself, because in the hereafter we are accountable to, our actions and deeds that we do. So leadership for us is, from the point of Islamic based leadership, it is a trust. And in Arabic we call it as amana. It's something you owe to the people, right? So it's a matter of trust, and what can we offer to them? Each and every action is accountable. And then the main, additional layer, unlike the other leadership theories, is that it is you are accountable. There is future thinking, there is an afterlife. So,
All right, so I wanted to pause there. And Lydia, remind me if I'm passing it to someone else or if I'm sharing my next video.
We're gonna have Sean come in just to break up the videos a bit. So we'll have Sean do his introduction, and then after Sean, we'll have you back, Madhu, for Anjan.
Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Sean Brown, Sean Federico Brown. I'm of Panamanian descent, and so I have to put the Puerto Rico in there. I mean, the Federico, which is my middle name. And it's a privilege to be with you guys. A little bit about myself. I grew up in a New York City public education system, became a teacher, assistant principal, and principal. And then I got into the urban education program. I studied under Deborah Shanley and Juan Battle. My field of expertise is quantitative data analysis. I know you guys are looking forward to that quant class. It's a lot of fun for everyone who enjoys math. But I did fall in love with the quantitative data analysis course. It was really important for me. I wasn't going to show any slides, but I felt like there's some competition going on here, and I need to show a slide or two just to let people know where I'm coming from. Do I need to or no?
You don't need to, but I'm gonna make you.
I'm just joking. I'm not.
All right, I don't want you to feel pressure. No competition. No one's showing
feel like,
anybody up. Even though Madhu has, the international coalition.
He's got international relationships and stuff. Right now, I'm teaching at Brooklyn College in educational leadership program. My course is finance and management. And I also do some mentoring through Rutgers University for international students that are getting familiar with the country, coaching some folks from Sudan, and helping them create some systems in their own country to improve their educational systems. And the questions that I ask are all around Black male students and what systems and structures we can create to improve outcomes for Black male students. That was the focus of my dissertation, and it embodied mostly a quantitative aspect. And now that I'm out of the program, my focus is more qualitative, and I get a chance to see the experiences of Black male students in K through 12 settings, teachers, administrators, and having informal conversations with those folks about some of the variables that positively and negatively impact the outcomes. And that's pretty much it.
Hey, thank you, Sean. So we will bring Madhu back to bring Anjan into the conversation.
Cool. This is a good chance for me also to thank everyone. Taylor, who you're going to meet in a second, Sean, Shobita, who I just have gotten a chance to meet, including Anjan, who I'm going to share a video with, and Dr. Amatullah Tasneem, who we just shared, for giving their time for this panel. Something I've talked to most of them about in a range of fierce debates about like education and what we're even doing. Are we even able to make a difference? And all those conversations I'm sure you've all had. So I just appreciate you all dive in with those conversations. This last video I'm going to show is a short one. This is from Anjan Prakash, and I should note both her and Dr. Amatullah, they invite you to reach out to them if you have questions, if you want to. Why I liked and wanted to connect with Anjan is because she rejected the whole system of education. She's like, I'm done with it, and I want to start my own program that is going to work with youth in India on a whole different way of conceptualizing what it means to relate not just to each other, but to the world around us. So I'll play this short video from her.
The way it is traditionally. So let me ask you, you are trying to experiment with new models of schooling. How do you see us being able to disrupt some of the standard practices of schooling? And particularly, I want to ask you, what can we learn from the incredible richness of cultural traditions and the richness of nature and our ecological relationships?
Yeah. Firstly, I want to start by thanking Urban Education Program and City University, New York. I also want to thank you, Madhu, for considering time to put in my thoughts into this beautiful panel that you've curated. So really a big thanks. Yeah. Firstly, I just want us to sort of understand the big picture. When it comes to any such question, I always first zoom out and see how would nature do it? How does nature address such situations? As a biomimicry professional, I think that's the first question that sort of comes to me. But it's not just because I'm a biomimicry professional. I think from when I was young, this huge friendship with nature always makes me want to ask the question, how do we learn from nature? You know, when we look at the larger context of Earth being 4.5 billion years old, and life started on this Earth 3.8 billion years ago with a single-celled bacteria, the beauty of life has been that it's always created conditions conducive for more life to thrive, which is why we are in this one big party of so many organisms inhabiting the Earth. And so all the ecosystems that are in the natural world, we too are a part of nature and part of that ecosystem, sort of functions on a certain beautiful principles that's allowed for life to flourish. So when we look at the education system, and then we start to think, how do we root that in the way the natural ecosystem functions? Then the word disruption takes on a very positive meaning. So I first want us to sort of look at the word disruption itself and see how does that look like in nature. And in nature, the word disruption is not negative. It's not us versus them. It's not right versus wrong. It's not good versus bad. It's about the birthing of new possibilities, the birthing of new ways of thinking. And it's more about, okay, this part has worked so far, and some elements of it are no more working. So how do we adapt and evolve? And that adaptation and evolution that happens is what disruption is in nature. So when I bring this back to your question about how do we disrupt, then I would also invite us to step back and ask the question, why are we disrupting? You know, what are we disrupting to open up new possibilities, new perspectives, new choices for the young people, the young learners? And then what do we not have to disrupt? Because in nature, there are certain strategies that work. And so when a disruption occurs in the form of a forest fire or a tsunami or an earthquake, you know, it's not that everything changes. There are some principles that are timeless and that carries forward, and there are some things that change. So what are we going to keep when we are designing the new ecosystem of education? And that's what I would think. And then comes the question about why is it that we want to change the current ecosystem of education? And I come back to the fact that we need to make sure that all learners have possibilities. The current education system is important and probably does cater to a certain type of learners, but it doesn't cater to a lot of other types of learners. And we need to now show them possibilities, show them choices, show them that their expression also matters in this world. And therefore, disruption for me in this current education system is more about showing possibilities and new ways of thinking. And once we understand what needs to change and why it needs to change, then, like in nature, form follows function. And then we can see, does it need a school? Does it need a learning space? Does it need people to just meet regularly to have dialogues and conversations? That structure and that container can be decided based on the what. And that's how I would see as a designer looking at it. And probably that's what I'm trying to apply to the way I design my programs too. And it's a work in progress, but this is the intention I hold and the big picture perspective from which I've been thinking about the system.
Thank
Okay, so Anjan's an incredible person. She said she welcomes any of you reaching out to her if she has any questions, and she's kicking off this new design program in India for a collection of youth. And so I'm excited to see what she comes up with and how she can disrupt, in the positive sense, the institution of education. So I guess I get to kick it over to Taylor now.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Hey friends, good to see you all. And it's so good to be in this space with you all as well. I've known Madhu for quite a while now, and it's just such a pleasure to connect with some of his other colleagues in another part of his life, and see some faces on here that I have recalled or been in the same room with in the past as well. So it's good to rekindle. Name is Taylor Delhagen. I also was a Teach for America Corps member way back in 2006, Shobita. So, I see you. And I've had a lot of thinking and musings that have come up since that time. I was able to soon after my my Corps member commitment in Crown Heights, decided to stay in the classroom. And after 3 years of teaching, you know everything about teaching, and they let you open up a school, right? Please hear the facetiousness in my voice. But I did join up with a team to open up a school with Achievement First, and so I was at Achievement First Brooklyn High School, and I was there for about 7 years or so. And then started to question some of the things that were happening there, and loved a lot of it, but also wanted to see some other things, and was able to engage with a Fulbright in India, where I was there for about 1.5 years doing research and looking at how history teachers were teaching about the freedom movement there, and how their instruction changed or did not change based on where I was in the country. And so I was able to travel around quite a bit throughout the subcontinent and spend a lot of time in classrooms and with teachers and with students, kind of uncovering that narrative as well. It was fascinating. I loved it. And when I came back to the States, helped open up another school in Brownsville, where I was there for about 4 years. To then, it's when I joined Madhu at the Relay Graduate School of Education, where I teach history teachers, and I still do to this day. I'm also at Boston College. I'm at the Lynch School, where I'm doing my doctorate work. I am in the Leadership in Higher Ed program, and I have become obsessed with thinking about outcomes, thinking about broadening outcomes specifically beyond the narrow kind of scope of academic mastery. I think when I think about like the traditional grammar of schooling, I'm thinking about who's created it and why it looks and sounds and feels the way that it does. And the conclusion that I keep coming back to is this idea of it's been created by the folks that it worked for, and not so much for the folks that it has not worked for. And so we can see this, like, and trace this continuation of the traditional grammar of schooling as it kind of propagates all over the world. And Madhu was talking about that idea of schools looking very similarly in other places that he has been. And I was in Bucharest this past spring, for a conference, and I just had this like another realization when I was in the back of this room. I've told this story to Madhu before, so I'm sorry, but I was in the back of this room. I had kind of like gone into this room. I kind of found like this small little chair. It was like an elementary school classroom that I was invited into. And I tried to be as like incognito as possible as I found my way to the back, found one of those small little chairs and desks and tried to slide my long legs underneath. But of course, I'm making a big mess and causing commotion. And all the kids are looking, and the teacher is frantically trying to get their attention back to the front of the room. I just had this moment where I'm like, oh my God, I've seen this movie before. It was the same board. It was the same agenda. It was the same just way that the teacher was talking to students, not with students. It was the same. It's the same of classrooms that I saw in India, whether I was in my time in New York, whether it was in the United Kingdom or Spain or a variety of places that I've been. I was just like, just flabbergasted on how, in that moment, how similar it was. And so again, I've been like really obsessed with trying to think about like, how can we start to think about teacher preparation in slightly different ways, and in a way that really contextualizes the place, the culture, the home, the students. And so I actually just got back from Peru not too long ago, where I was looking at 3 different case studies for my research and looking at teachers who are attempting to kind of break out of that box, out of that grammar of schooling. And I'm just like still putting together the data and analyzing it, but it was really cool, especially this one classroom way up in Ancash, up in the Andes. And thinking about the work that she's doing with her students is giving me hope for what we can then learn from this case study, and how we can then think about how we are thinking beyond the narrow scope of academic mastery to include things like well-being, connectedness, awareness, agency, in order to think about a new future for what schools look like, sound like, and feel. But thank you again for letting me be a part of this space. It's a real privilege.
All right, thank you. So now we're going to switch gears. Everyone, hi, my name is Andrea, cohort 17. Questions are swirling for me, but since our Praxis event is set up, differently from traditional like panel discussions, we'd like to invite folks, the panelists, to ask each other questions. And if you have some slides, try to incorporate those slides into answering those questions or offering up some new knowledge. And if you don't have slides, that's okay. But I want to kind of kick this off with one question first. And those of you who would like to answer, please just go ahead. The question is that no matter where you travel in the globe, as we've heard, educational institutions tend to share several similarities. Why? And if this is true, in your opinion, is it possible to have a just and equitable world within a standardized system? If not, where do we go from here? What are your ideas and thoughts on that? And any one of the panelists can jump on that question.
I can talk to the science piece, and I love the question. Thanks, Andrea. Like ed institutions, having worked in New York and having worked in India, I'm interested in seeing intersections of class and outcome. And I find in programs in the West and here, when you have money, there are programs that are IB, International Baccalaureate. Science students get to experience the field, they get to be innovative. We don't teach necessarily out of textbooks. You teach students through actual application and inquiry, and access to labs and materials is all about wealth. And so that's one similarity that I see across cultures. It's really about, we can't just talk about India as India or New York as New York. Within our education ecosystems, neighboring kids have access to different things, depending on how much parents are paying. Public systems, I find, are so much harder to break. So that's why I wanted to follow up with Taylor when he says certain schools and certain teachers, and I think you said Peru, get to break the norm. I find that I can break the norm again, out of public spaces, and I'm encouraged to break norms. But when it comes to public education, it's always standardized, and that I see across, from India to the US, and oftentimes with this praxis that those standards are straight out of the UK. In former colonies, where we continue to copy the curriculum of the colonizer, depending on what language you do. So that's just part of what I see, and that I would like to add to it later, but I want to hear from other panelists, like, what do we do about this now?
Yeah, my answer to that question, and I've said it to all of you people on the panel before, but it's an emphatic no. And I think it's an extension of that element of critical race theory of interest convergence, which is that no advancement can be made in critical race theories for Black people in the United States. No advancement can be made without some benefit given to the dominant group, in that case, white people. But I think you can extend that to colonial relationships, to global relationships. And it's interesting that you talk about that, Shobita, because essentially what you're saying is that public systems, which are a trust of the people, are government investment or the investment of the people in schools, comes with a certain contract, and you can't break those as a teacher. In fact, when you sign up to be a teacher, you're agreeing to further a common denominator agenda. Whereas in a private space, you are free to do that. And the kind of other thing you said is that those private spaces there's a barrier to enter those, which is often a financial barrier. I have a kind of similar question I'd love to ask Taylor, which is kind of building off the question you asked Rhea, which is that if you're in education for any period of time, I'm sure all of you encounter this about what are the best practices to teach something. And if you're training teachers, we're often like, well, let's teach teachers these common best practices on how to structure a lesson, design a curriculum. And I mean, Taylor, you're kind of knee deep in teacher prep. Is it possible to have a set of best practices that are global without them being homogenizing and inattentive to local contexts?
I don't know. How's that for a panel answer? I mean, this is what I am just like hitting my head against again and again. I don't know. What I do know, and I don't think this is like, I'm not trying to dodge your question, but I do think that there are case studies that we can learn from, where we can say like, like that's what Nico is doing in Chabin, or that is what I'm seeing, Shobita do in Bangalore. Or I think there are case studies which we can then say like, okay, I can see practice X, Y, and Z happening in that context. How can I then maybe use something here in my own context? And the contextualization process, I think, is key to that, without making it so cookie cutter like that it fits into, teach like a champion version 2.3081, whatever that may be. But like, I think that there's, and I am kind of putting a, kind of shaking my head at that a little bit. I think that there's real danger when we start to put something into like a rigid taxonomy, that you start to say like, this is the way that you do, this move in a classroom. I think that's really damning to what can then happen to the creativity of a teacher. And that is then parallel to the students as well. So I'm so hesitant to say yes to that question, just because of the ramifications of it. And at the same time, I think that there's real merit in going out and finding case studies that can say like, hey, I saw this happen in this context. This is a learning opportunity for me in my context. And then just quickly here, like to Shobita, to your point there that you were asking, or kind of alluding to, with your comment there, is, and Madhu, you too, in terms of like the public education system, the social contract that teachers kind of sign in a sense with the public system. I think the best teachers that I have seen in my time visiting classrooms, they have been the teachers who have found a way to circumvent that contract. they've been the teachers who have found ways to say, this, I'm actually going to bend that contract a little bit. I'm going to bend it until it's just about broken. And I'm going to take my students, or I'm going to work with, keyword, with my students to do something slightly different. And so there's kind of this like parameters, that this canvas that best teachers get to work on. There's still a canvas. It's not like they're going out and trying to draw on something that doesn't exist yet. There's still something there that is a little bit confining, but they just get so creative with it and bending it as much as humanly possible.
Well, I think for myself, when I think about the question, always think about what are the results, right? When you do quantitative data analysis, it's a lot about the results and correlational matrices and linear regressions. And what you see is that the results are producing the numbers that the system was created to produce, and it preserves a certain group and another group continues to struggle. And specifically in the Department of Education, what happens is they create new initiatives and there's special funding that's sent in, but redirecting the way the system is designed, it's not good for money. It messes up money. It messes up relationships with companies who are invested in making everything standardized and making folks dependent upon the system and not to think freely. I think about myself, again, my focus is always on Black and brown males. The other side of it is, because everybody talks about, there's 1.3% Black men in the educational field teaching. And I always wondered, does anyone think about what happens to those folks like myself who stay in the system as you're doing this work? Even if you do find success with those who are on the margins, guess what? They send you more students like that, and they expect you to do more work. So if you're looking for where most Black and brown men who are educators are seated, look at Southside Jamaica, Queens, Bronx, Brownsville, Bushwick, East New York, and you are not hired based on your intellect. You're hired based on your brawn or your perceived brawn. And so the system being designed the way that it is, for myself, I get a chance to, and and me and Madhu talks about this, it's a struggle to know what I know and then work within this system every single day. It became so difficult, especially as a student, to battle against what I'm creating, what I'm producing, and what I know is right for children. And there's so many systems and structures to perpetuate those disparities, and the students who are referred to special education and the students who are sent into certain geographical sections of the city. Right now, what we're looking at is the migrant situation. And guess where most of the bilingual migrants are being sent? You guessed it, to the Bronx, to Bushwick. And when I ask questions, there's no accountability. Therefore, it's systemic and it's done intentionally. This is not a mistake. And so for myself, the standardized system that they have, it's connected to finances. When you go to principals, and Madhu knows this, when you go to principals meetings, these are long commercials about new curriculum that is going to change the life of our marginalized children, and it does not. Now there's this new thinking about the science of reading and phonemic awareness, when teachers have been talking about this for the longest. People are moving away from whole literacy, and I know I'm going in 1,000 different directions, but I think that the system, and Stephen Bride talks about this a lot when he taught the course. He always talked about looking at the history. Just look at the history of when a system was created, and then you will know why it produces the numbers it produced. And we took a look at James Anderson's work around Blacks in education in the South, and it's pretty much consistent. It's very consistent in producing the numbers that it was meant to produce. So the bigger question is, do we want to change the system, and what's going to happen once you do? You'll be held accountable to do more with less, from my experience.
Sean was talking about standardization. What I find interesting is standardization in Western practices of science are benefiting international students in a way that's not applicable in New York City schools. International students are filling seats in STEM programs across the United States, and I constantly question why my own students in the Bronx aren't getting into these spaces. Or even if you look at New York City, working in the Bronx and Bronx High School of Science, the Bronx is 55% Latin American and 45% Black American. But the presence at Bronx High School of Science, which is one of the most esteemed science high schools in the country, is, I believe, 5% African American and like 2% Latino. So it's interesting. So you were talking about standardization, especially in like physics, chemistry, and bios. It's the same all over the world. Chemistry is the same or modern chemistry is the same in China, India, California. So I think international students are benefiting from these standards, even with minus the wealth. A villager or somebody who doesn't have access knows that science is the key out of the village or a key to more independence. And I don't see that happening in the States for my students. So I just want to throw that out there, like just to make it collide. And you talk about Black male students as well. So how do we bring that? And it's obvious there's money involved, but why are we not helping our own students in the US get this kind of access?
And this is going to be like maybe some ignorance talking, should be to that point, but when we think about, are you talking about like in higher ed, those seats being filled?
Well, no, I'm talking about the foundations in science up to like 9 to 12.
9 to 12, okay.
Being competitive and being able to pass biology as a freshman at a CUNY school. And if you don't know chemistry from 11th grade, just the foundations of chemistry, you're probably going to drop out and do something else. And something else isn't bad, but you might have wanted to be a nurse or a doctor or an engineer your whole life. And, even in our New York City schools, we're not preparing, I don't think, necessarily a workforce of kids who can be prepared to do that. Freshman bio kicked my ass. It was hard. It was like, I had to know, and I had taken AP Chem in Indiana, and it was still so hard for me to get through that first semester. And at CUNY, we have programs like Seek and Discoveries at Columbia, but there's an assumption that if a student's coming from some schools, many of our New York City schools, that they're going to need extra support in calculus and other classes that you still need for that first year to get a Bachelor of Science program. And then there might be students coming from other countries where that standardization, it's boring, it's rote, it's like, the same kind of testing, it's rigorous, but it's been done. And so international students can come and fill those spaces and they're prepared. So the standards are working better for maybe people outside of the United States. But the standards are maybe working against some of our students. I don't know. It is a question. That's kind of what my research is. Like, how do we make these things more accessible? And not only in the United States, but what's working elsewhere? How do we do this exchange?
I'm wondering,
oh, good.
I'm just wondering, are they getting, I have a hard time with that because I'm thinking about is it the chemistry? Is it the biology? Is it the content, the deeper learning that could happen there? Or is it the way that they are being taught that content, the pedagogy of it? And I think that there's a key difference there. And I'm wondering what is happening in those different places that's causing those different results, because we're still measuring it, to Sean's point, we're still measuring it by this one baseline way of thinking about whether a student is going to go on to the next level of biology or chemistry or whatever it may be. And I think when we see those schools or the teachers who are bending what it looks like to be proficient or to kind of engage in that deeper learning, we're seeing something that's a little bit more outside of the box, if you will.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is actually something you just reminded me of the other day, Taylor. But Shobita, when you say standardization, in my head, I hear the word gatekeeping or gates in education that with someone standing in the way. And that's essentially stealing from Lisa Delpit and the culture of power. And she's not talking about science, she's talking about literacy and ways of speaking. But I can't think of a better subject than science. Science is a place where these really grounded benchmarks, grounded in certain cultural frames are created. And you mentioned, Shabita, you mentioned IB as like a way that international students kind of show their proficiency. And it reminds me of advanced placement courses. And this is what you just passed on the other day, Taylor, about how the AP for all is a push. And I got to tell you, when you talk about like advertisements and principal meetings, we had people come to our our superintendent's meetings for the principalships is for principals in our district to say, you should really do advanced placement for all. You should sign up all your students in your Title I school to take the advanced placement test and to use the course and to send your teachers to the training program. And it was justified under the discourse of high expectations. And I mean, I'm all for high expectations. I believe students should be exposed to rigorous curricula. But then you look at the AP curricula where they're cramming 4 years worth of curriculum into 1 year. They're really emphasizing breadth over depth, and it's literally the opposite of culturally responsive education. It's not meeting students where they're at, is instead dragging students to where you believe they should be. It just makes me think of everything you said around standardization. It feels like standardization is another way of saying homogenization. And it's just leaves me feeling really uncomfortable.
Yeah, also I think about how much the other, there's so many different variables that impacts the outcomes for our students, because I have, this is just myself. I grew up in the housing projects with a single parent, and my dad was in prison, and I wasn't necessarily thinking about AP courses and how I can get a better SAT score. I had to work and go to a CUNY school, and I had to stay home and help out. So I think some of these basic needs of students is a big part of what takes away from their performance in the classroom, not intellect at all whatsoever. I use my children as a case study, where we were living in Brooklyn and now we moved to another place in Long Island. Don't ask me about that. But the basic needs, when you look at Maslow's theory, that children have really interrupts their ability to learn and be successful. And I feel like the educational system, for example, you are given one guidance counselor per 200 students. That is exactly what they think about the social and emotional needs of children. One person is going to take care of all of the deeper needs that our students have. And I have students who want to do well and they want to participate, but they have a lot of challenges outside of the classroom that negatively impacts their performance in the classroom. And I always think about that when I'm dealing with the students in Bushwick. What structures and systems are in place to help them deal with those variables, those components of daily life that interrupts their ability to perform?
Want to acknowledge that there's a really great conversation, some questions happening in the chat as well. It's amazing to be hearing this conversation and also what the folks in the room are discussing in the chat. I think it would be a good time to have, one person, let's have one person from the chat or the audience pose a question as this conversation is evolving, and then we can get back to kind of the questions that y'all had developed for yourselves, if that's okay. Yeah. Does anyone from the audience, from these amazing questions here, want to? Okay, I see Deborah.
Good evening, everybody. I want to pick up on what Sean just said, and I think that it's so critical. What we're talking about is a full court press. You know, I hate to use the basketball metaphor, but that's what it is. And Sean, as you were pointing out, many of our kids need more than we as teachers, as principals, or whatever, guidance counselors, whatever, can give. And that's why our partnerships with our community-based organizations, who else out there in the community can join hands with us to help make something different happen? You know, and that's what I have found after, I'm embarrassed to tell you, 49 years of working with young people and seeing where those young people are now. A lot of it was not about me. But it was about the ability to bring people together that could make it happen. It's one kid at a time, it's one teacher, one school counselor at a time, but it's also a team. And I think that's where listening to the panel discussion on teacher prep, I think that's where we get it wrong. We're focusing too much on the teacher as the lone person instead of teaching them how to network so many other rich resources that are available to them in the context of the community in which they're working. I so appreciate this conversation. Sean, thanks for bringing that up because it really goes to my heart.
Great, thank you. Thank you so
Deborah.
much for that.
I also see Diana. I also see Diana's hand. I want to invite Diana and then we can switch back again to the panelists' questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First, I want to thank the panelists and Urban Education for organizing this. This is really such a dope conversation. I saw David Stovall come up in the chat. And so I guess the question that I have for you all is, you know, as we're looking at these institutions and thinking about the different intersections where they live and where they exist, do we think that this oppression, liberalism, is it part of the DNA of these institutions? And can we actually change them, or should we be putting our efforts into creating something completely new and different? So again, just to sum it up, are we really focusing on transforming the existing institutions, or should we be focusing our sights elsewhere?
Thank you, Diana. I so wish that Anjan was here to answer that question. I feel like thinking about her provocation of, you know, what would nature do, right, is a very interesting starting point for thinking about some alternative ways forward, because that was absolutely not the genesis for the world of schooling that we're critiquing and questioning tonight. But I'm curious to hear from our panelists what they might have to say.
I think,
I'm sorry.
Sean, go ahead and I'll go. I want to pull a slide up. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that me teaching at Brooklyn College, me being a principal, is a form of rebellion. Me being a part of this panel is a form of rebellion. And what I mean by that is I hate always having to be the Black man in the room. And I think about John Henryism and the level of fatigue that you feel as a Black man in educational spaces. It doesn't matter how many degrees you have. It doesn't matter your accomplishments. There's always going to be this microaggressive questioning of your intellect. And in terms of changing the system, you know, my friend's a Marxist and he believes in, you know, some crazy things. But I do believe that we're not at a stage as a society to function in that way in mass. But I think individual actors within a broken system eventually turns the system around. And that's what I think conversations like this does. It inspires, it encourages, and it gets folks who are listening to start thinking about the role that they play within this system. And hopefully we get to a place where we're united with one another, and we set aside certain differences and realize we're on the same team. But I do think it's important that individuals within the system rebel in their own way. You know, I liken it to what happened on plantations, where you'd have, and people feel uncomfortable about it, but it's the truth. You had some guys who worked in the field and you had some that worked in the house. They were on the same team and they had different functions. And I think for us, we've just got to do what we need to do as actors within this system to turn it around. So.
I love that so much, Sean. I'm just, thinking about what it means for each of us to think about how to be rebellious wherever we are in whatever way in concerted collective effort. Other thoughts, Shobita? I think you had a response you wanted to jump in with.
I think it was in response to what Deborah was asking. I think a lot of times my biggest joys in teaching in New York were always outside of the classroom. When I first started, I'm a BU Taylor, 1993 Teach for America. I used to be able to get a whole bunch of kids on the train and just go to the botanical garden or go to Central Park, and we would play. And, it was a different time. And that's when learning was happening. I find now those spaces, it's harder to be able to take a trip for a day or just go somewhere, because teachers now have, the system has evolved. And we're doing those ticks on a box, and we don't have time in a curriculum to do all those fun things. So in today's world, I try to connect with nonprofits and after school programs and Saturday school. And, now my joy is, yes, the third space, exactly. And that's how I find being able to do more of that play to get kids involved. So that's the evolution that I've seen in the city. And just one more thing, I was just going to show one slide. What I'm studying here, and this is not an ideal space. Oops, wait. Is that it? Yeah. But when I came into what I wanted to study, I thought I would compare different spaces where you interview an educator, an organizer, a funder, a student, and an elder. Okay, and I was trying to see how I can kind of put those pieces together. But what I found here is that what I'm learning is that the project that I'm studying is funded by a corporate that I don't know how many years ago, India has now something called CSR, corporate social responsibility, where every corporate working in a locale has to mandated to give 2% of funds to social responsibility. So this model is kind of saying, and I dare I say this in this space, but funding, money is what matters. So if it's not governments that are giving the money, in this case study, I'm finding that this corporate is what's been funding this project. And now that the project has become sustainable, the funding goes to the next village to clean up the landfill, to empower the people, to bring education to a different standard. So I'm wondering how we can do that. And where is that private money going in public spaces here? In the States. And I know it's not all about money, but money is a tool right now. And so I think I was deferring to what Deborah was asking, who are the players that we can now tap into? If we're only looking at this old model that we all learned in urban education, like how public education was set up in the United States, it's definitely racist, it was definitely classist, and we created caste in America, similar to the caste system that exists in India that's 10,000 years old. So this model, I just wanted to share this tiny bit because I think we need to look beyond just saying, okay, what are the standards? What is the school saying? And what is the state government and the federal government mandating as standardization? And without that funding, I don't know how to break systems, especially in the West. We'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I think just to go off of that too, that's fascinating. By the way, Shavita, I love seeing that the image too. money. I mean, it's so interesting. My wife was also a 2006 core member. We met in college though. We moved to New York. It's a love story. It's great. But she worked in public schools. She and was a leader in public schools. And then in our last couple of years living in New York City, which we just moved a couple of years ago, she went and worked at Avenues School of the World up in Chelsea. Her mentor had gone there and she was like, I gotta go check this out. And I'm like, you're gonna go there? You really? Sorry if that's rubbing anybody the wrong way, but I'm like, that is like a whole other, like, what are we doing? Like, we are in education for other purposes than to go to Avenues. And she's like, I have to go see what's going on there. She's like, I feel like a responsibility to go and see. And she was there for 2 years and she was like, had like two big reflections that were coming out of that. The first one was simple and it was so complex, was money, money, money. And the second one was just like the freedom, the autonomy. And Madhu and I, we just were in this looking at this idea of teacher autonomy. And she's like, teachers have so much autonomy to flex in ways that like teachers at the schools that I was at previously did not have. But Shabita, I just, when you were talking about the funding, I was just immediately thought of that. But then to the question again about like, you know, like how do we change, or can we change these systems? And like, I just think we have to keep trying. We need people. If we don't, if we resign ourselves to just being like, nope, it's messed, like we're just gonna have to work within the system. No, we need people who are gonna constantly elbow and constantly be gadflies and constantly think about like how to do this thing differently. We have to. The moment that we resign ourselves to like what is happening in the current grammar of schooling, we have given up. And I don't want any part to do with that. So I'm going to keep poking and keep prodding because like we have to think differently about like what this is going to look like, sound like, feel like. Yeah, especially within teacher prep. Like it is like even like the disruptors, to pull like a word there in the world of teacher preparation, and whether it's like the small N GSEs, the new graduate schools of education that are popping up. And I just think, and this is like kind of the working title of my dissertation right now, but is that we got good at a bad model. And I just see that happening again and again and again. Like even folks who say that we're doing it differently, I'm looking at it, it doesn't look much different. I don't know, but like it just doesn't look much differently, even though there might be like a new fancy like I don't know platform for how they're showcasing it, or there's a new name in a taxonomy book for how we call such and such practice, but like the orientation is still the same. And I think that's what we need to start thinking differently about.
Thank you. I just want to do a time check. We're about 15 minutes out, and we had some really great questions that the panelists are prepared to ask each other. Is there any, do you want to take this in another direction, or do we want to continue on this thread? Because I saw some really cool questions on our board.
I just want to add one quick note to what Shobita and Taylor were saying. Okay, Shobita kind of raised the question, do we need to acknowledge that private funding or money in general, but maybe private interest is a way to push models of education? And I feel like that question, if you ask it in the United States right now, you could be labeled as a someone who's lost faith in public education, or believes in the privatization or the corporatization of education. And to me, that question, it feels like the question's already been answered in most of the world, which is that in most of the world, there's government-sponsored education, which is for the have-nots, and even people in lower middle class parts of society are pursuing private solutions to their children's education, which means they may invest in some unaccredited and skeptical of shoddy quality education for their children, but they can't discern because they don't have the purchasing power of someone else who can buy some other brand name education for their children. And it's definitely unsettling. But I feel like as educators, we kind of have to reckon with that reality because it's kind of already here.
Yeah, I think in terms of funding, whether private or public,
Yeah.
For example, if you analyze the fair student funding model in New York City and you compare it to other states that have a school board and so on and so forth, it's not so much the funding. There's funding available. It's the amount of constraints and how educational leaders are almost forced to do things with funding that they don't even believe in. And what I mean by that is, and Madhu, you know this, you sit down with your budgeting director at the end of the year, they look at your spending, they look at how many gen ed, special education, E&L students you have, they look at the curriculum that you're using and the teachers that you're hiring, and 80% of the budget is already pre-populated. So, you try and piece together per session lines to pay folks to do a little bit of work afterwards, before school and after school. And your ability to be creative with the funding that you have is limited within public education. So my budget is approximately $5-6 million every year. From that $5-6 million, I have roughly $100,000 of flexibility in terms of what I can do based on what I believe is necessary and possible. I have been talking about the need for phonemic awareness programs in high schools for the longest. I have been saying this. I've been talking about the importance of getting back to the science of literacy, the science of reading and writing. I teach a standalone E&L course with newcomers. It is my joy. It is my happiness. It is my safe space. It gives me, it's like I'm paying my Panamanian family members back, and I'm helping them. When you said this before, you got pulled into a meeting. It's not rigorous. You're not challenging students, and you're not preparing them for state exams. Now, it's a new regime. This is the greatest thing on earth. What's going to happen when the politics change? A new person takes a seat, and we move away from what's scientifically proven to work to whatever new fad there is. So the funding is there. I think I would challenge this, whether it's private or charter, the funding is there. My question is always, are educational leaders and teachers given the freedom to do what they believe is best for students?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sometimes what's best for students isn't always proven quantitatively, just because it's effective, but you might not see it on a test score. So I think that's the question, is how do we measure effectiveness truly? I'm sorry, Shapita.
No, I'm with you on that. I don't have anything to say. The measure of effectiveness that goes back to our schooling also. Are we Booker T. Washington, again from the science space, or are we Du Bois? Are we measuring success like what the best school is? Are we measuring success in finding solutions to environmental crises? I love what you're asking, Sean. I don't have answers, but I do know that we have potential in my students, and my students don't always have the same access that other students have. And so I just go back to that same space. Like, I'm a chemistry teacher, and in places where there's no physics teachers. I'm not trained in chemistry. I'm trained more in bio, but I can get a job anywhere almost in the world now because there's no chemistry teachers. And I'm now digressing, but I want to think about how we can stop talking about what's not working and start thinking about what is working. And I just like, and a little bit of segue into like that whole idea of indigenous knowledge and indigenous science. We are rooted still in this, back to Madhu's topic, the colonial ways of learning. And it's not like India didn't have science before the westernized ideas of science, not like China, South, all of us, the global South or Celtic, anywhere. But today's language of science is that one rooted in the Western canon. How do we now exist in a space towards the future that combines the best of indigenous with what is standardized now? And that's, yeah, I'm just ranting, but that's how I'm starting to think now that I'm away. And oftentimes when I'm in New York, I get bogged down with what I can't do. And so stepping out of New York City kind of refreshes, because I see what is being done elsewhere. And it's never perfect elsewhere because there are government structures and there's disparity everywhere. But yeah, we're globalized now, so we have to figure out these best practices. And one other thing, just I'll leave it here. Being away, there was a time when everybody wanted to go to the US for education, and I'm finding now that people are not. So that's interesting too. Students are going more to Europe, Australia, and I'm talking about Eastern Hemisphere, and the US isn't as as enticing anymore. So that's just something to throw out as well.
Thinking a lot about like the fear that goes into these decisions too, like that keeps people from making progress in these ways. Like how, it's the fear of the unknown. And, this was mentioned earlier in, I think, a comment that Sean, I think you had made, or Madhu, you said something about like how you had the AP person from the College Board come to you and like they were pitching this idea of like, you're kind of trying to sell you the AP curriculum. And it's kind of like pushed, well, if you don't do this, then you don't believe in what our kids can do. You don't believe in equity. And it's just like, that is some gaslighting right there. And it's more than that. It's just like people keep going in that direction because there's so much fear that's put on their shoulders of like, well, if I go in this other direction, if I start to broaden outcomes in a real meaningful way, where I start to measure connectedness, awareness, agency, and well-being, as well as academic mastery, which is so important. But if I start to broaden those things and it doesn't work in the first like 6 months, I'm going to have like the carpet taken out from under my feet, because we are so short-sighted, and immediacy is everything in that way. And that's like the culture of urgency. And that's like that is whiteness. And we have to take a stop on that too, and think about like how that's dictating how we are, one, thinking about teaching and learning, and two, educating teachers.
I also just wanted to add that there is a component there around trust, like where there is such little trust in, in the funders and the private organizations that are like throwing money at these things, in that the people themselves know what is best for them, for their for their healing, for their movement forward, for their progress, for their understanding and conceptualization of the world and knowledge creation. There is such little trust there. And I think that that's so difficult to navigate, especially as, somebody who's working with young people who, understand that they kind of know a little bit about what it is that they need, and they communicate it, but we're unable to sometimes meet that need because we're, in this relationship where it's like, well, why are you trusting that young person that they know what is right?
Yeah, I think also the systems are set up as a hierarchy that perpetuates abuse from the top. It is designed to be a very isolating system that allows abuse. And I'm saying this, full transparency as a principal. At any moment that I choose to abuse my authority, I can. and there's structures and systems in place that allows me to. If I wake up and I feel like having a narcissistic experience and, you know, using a rating or whatever to go after a teacher, you can, and there's no accountability. And I think about colleagues who, and why does it, I think about, you know, why does it happen and why is it structured in that way? And I think about colleagues who, educators who, you don't realize unless you're a principal, you don't understand the types of conversations folks have about teacher autonomy and freedom and having transparent dialogue about what's best for students and not abusing your position just because. And I think for myself, the system has to have accountability. It has to be done in a different way. When you look at the UFT in terms of the teachers union and the CSA system, I always say that it reminds me of an old African proverb where you have two elephants fighting, and the people who gets hurt the most the people who are hurt the most are the grass. And in this case, it would be the children. And when you look at some educational systems in some schools, there's so much tension between those two groups that getting to a point where you could teach children is almost impossible. And it's because the system is set up to protect some and to abuse others. And so I think about the school building structure itself and how that needs to change in terms of accountability and giving teachers freedom to do what they believe is best for students. And it's not necessarily based on quantitative outcomes. I do believe there should be a portfolio system in terms of helping students to graduate. I have friends who are brilliant, but they don't test well. And, you know, just reducing their level of intellect to an exam is not fair because, you know, there's different learners. So I think, but in doing that, we go back to the finances. It takes more money to create a portfolio system where people have to sit down and look at a student holistically in order to assess their ability to understand the curriculum. And that's why we move away from it. And so just my thoughts.
I mean, those are great thoughts. IB is all about portfolio. And when I think I was teaching in 1995 with Edwina Branch, and she was introducing portfolio-based assessment, and it was awesome. Our kids went to many universities and went on to do great things, but it was shut down, you know. And now for a school to become portfolio-based, there's so many hurdles and hoops that you have to jump through. But again, elite independent schools, they're all portfolio based. It's all about, you know, that's just how it works. There's one more thing that I was thinking about with portfolio. Oh, it goes back to the the Flexner report of 1910, where HBCUs, there were 13 medical schools in those days, and Flexner, who wasn't a doctor, was sent by the US government to Germany to study what real medicine was, and he comes back and they shut down 8 of those 13 med schools, HBCU med schools in 1910. So I feel like every time we figure out a way that is empowering and that works, that I've seen historically, that it's shut down. So our system in the US isn't meant for everybody to excel. And you see examples, and I've lived it, you know. Here we were at the New School of Arts and Sciences doing these portfolio graduation. This was 95, yeah, it was 1995, 96. And then that system had to get reborn. So as an educator in my own lifetime, and when I study the history about it, I see that every time there's an advancement made, I just think of those med schools, like indigenous practices, people from all over the world were going to HBCUs to get to become doctors. And in one swipe, you know, 8 of them were shut down. So look that up. I don't know how you reminded me of that, Sean, but because you were talking about portfolios and how we can approach, but you know, is it always accepted? And then why does it get shut down? Obvious.
All right, I'm looking at the time and I know that we could probably keep talking for another hour if Shobita wasn't in a totally different time zone and in need of getting back to sleep. Just kidding. But I really do want to just say a big thank you to everybody who came out for this event and made it possible. Our panelists made this evening possible with their ideas and their questions and their energy. We are so grateful to them. We also want to give a big thank you to all of our super participatory audience members. Thank you so much for that comment, Albalisa. Absolutely, a very rich conversation indeed. A big thank you to our administrative support team, Christine and Matt, our executive officer, Sherry Deckman, and also a big thank you to CUNY's Office of the Dean for Education, who has made funding available for this ongoing conversation series. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and stay tuned for the next one. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.